Denzel nodded slowly. I can't control what people project onto me, he said, but I can control what I say. And when I see a country tearing itself apart over sound bites and slogans, I'm going to say something, no matter who it upsets. Another panelist followed fast, their tone sharp. And what about when your words do the damage? Then I take responsibility, Denzel replied. But responsibility means standing here, owning it, facing it, not disappearing. He looked right at Kash. I'm here. Where are the others? That hit. It wasn't just about Denzel anymore. It was about everyone who'd been silenced, blacklisted, or pushed out, not because of crimes, but because of their thoughts. Kash exhaled slowly. You know, Denzel, he said quieter now, a lot of people at home think you're just doing this for a comeback. Denzel didn't smile. I don't need a comeback, he said. I need a country that hasn't forgotten how to forgive. The room fell silent. The camera angle switched tight on another panelist's face. She blinked. You could see it in her eyes. That line landed, not because it was flashy, but because it cut deep. Denzel looked toward the audience again. You don't have to like me, he said, but if you think canceling every flawed person makes the world better, you're not helping. You're hiding. A slow clap started, just one person at first, then two, then 10. Soon the room was filled with applause, louder than anything yet. The panelists glanced at one another, a shared look. They were no longer in control. The audience had chosen where to lean, and it wasn't toward the table. Denzel sat back. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk. He just let the noise wash over him because he knew. The moment they tried to turn him into a villain, he became something else instead. As the final commercial break ended, you could feel the showrunners scrambling behind the scenes. Segment cards were shuffled, closing questions rewritten. Producers whispered through earpieces, urging the panelists to wrap it up and move on. But you can't move on from a moment that shakes the room. You can only brace for what comes after. Kash tried to reclaim the spotlight. Well, Denzel, it's been eventful, he said with a tight smile. Before we go, anything you want to leave our audience with? Denzel nodded slowly. Yes, he said. Don't let the loudest people in the room decide what you're allowed to think. Don't hand over your voice to people who claim to speak for you, left or right, Hollywood or DC, because once you give it away, you don't get it back. The crowd stirred. It wasn't grandstanding. It wasn't a performance. It was a warning. Another panelist cut in quickly, trying to lighten the weight in the room. All right, well, thanks for coming, Denzel. We appreciate your candor. More like, thanks for surviving the firestorm we meant to burn you in. But Denzel didn't rise just yet. He looked directly at the panelists. I know why I was invited here, he said. You thought you'd teach me a lesson. Remind me I don't belong. He looked at the audience. But here's the thing, I don't need to belong to be right. And then he stood. A few people in the audience stood too. Then more. Applause again, louder, sharper, no longer polite. The camera caught it just for a second. Kash glancing off stage. A silent look of, what just happened? Because this wasn't how the segment was supposed to end. It wasn't how their interviews typically ended. It wasn't in their control anymore. Denzel Washington didn't just walk off the stage. He left behind a studio in chaos, ideologically, emotionally, reputationally. As the credits rolled and the music played, the panelists tried to smile through it, but they looked shell-shocked. The energy was off. You could feel it in the way they shuffled papers that didn't matter, in the stiffness of their laughter. And online, it had already begun. Clips, hashtags, headlines. Denzel Washington flips the script on The View. The moment the crowd turned, one sentence that shut down the panel. The show had been built for confrontation, but they never expected to lose. The broadcast may have ended, but the real show was just beginning. Within minutes, clips from the episode flooded social media, short, punchy segments. Denzel calmly responding to tough questions. Denzel challenging Kash Patel's definition of patriotism. Denzel standing as the crowd stood with him. It wasn't just trending, it was erupting. On Twitter, both sides of the aisle weighed in. Some hailed him as a truth teller, A rare voice with the guts to show up and speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. Others called it a PR stunt, an act of calculated provocation wrapped in calm tone and carefully worded barbs. But one thing was undeniable. No one was talking about the panel's message. They were talking about his. By mid-afternoon, several media outlets had already run with headlines. Denzel Washington hijacks the panel and wins the crowd. Viewers shocked by Denzel's poise, hosts silenced. Is daytime TV ready for real debate? Meanwhile, back at the studio, the fallout was setting in. Producers huddled over footage, deciding what to upload officially and what to quietly leave out. Interns were tasked with monitoring comment sections, most of which were leaning overwhelmingly toward Denzel. A leaked email from one staffer to another said it plainly. We brought him in thinking we'd frame him. Instead, he reframed us. Behind the scenes, Kash Patel was reportedly frustrated, not because he disagreed with Denzel, he always had, but because Denzel didn't crack. They threw every trick at him: personal history, moral questions, political accusations. He didn't stumble once. Other panelists were silent as they left the studio. No post-show social posts, no quote to press. Even the most seasoned panelist was heard muttering to a producer, he didn't take the bait. That's what scared them. Meanwhile, Denzel, he was gone. No follow-up interview, no press tour, no tweet storm, just silence. He'd said his piece, he didn't need to repeat it, and that silence made everything louder. By nightfall, even late-night shows were referencing it. Some mocked him, some mocked the panel, but even in mockery, the moment lived. It had legs, it had weight, and most importantly, it had viewers thinking. The panel had invited him in to corner him. Instead, he walked out, leaving them cornered by their own assumptions. The next morning, headlines were still pouring in. Every major outlet had picked up the story. The clips had amassed millions of views overnight. Commentators across the political spectrum dissected each exchange like it was a courtroom transcript. But the one moment they all came back to, the one that wouldn't fade, was the sentence, we've convinced ourselves that only one side gets to define what offensive means. It echoed on every platform, quoted by supporters and critics alike. Not because it was radical, but because it was true. And deep down, everyone knew it. Even those who disagreed with Denzel Washington had to admit it. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't evaded the hard questions, and most unexpectedly, he hadn't collapsed under pressure. Instead, he walked into a space designed to dismantle him, and dismantled the illusion that narrative was more powerful than clarity. But the true impact didn't show up in the headlines. It showed up in living rooms. Families that had long written him off sat together watching the clip, rewinding parts, talking about it. Not everyone agreed with him, but they talked, they debated, they listened. And isn't that what the entire show claimed to want? Some former critics even took to social media to acknowledge the shift. I'm no fan of Denzel Washington, but today he showed more courage on TV than I've seen in years. A progressive journalist. He said what we were all thinking and did it without venom. That's rare. A film crew union member of the panel, for its part, went quiet. No post-show highlight reel, no behind-the-scenes interviews. Just a vague tweet thanking Denzel for an honest conversation. A tweet that was ratioed within an hour. And Denzel, he returned to his quiet life. No public statements, no interviews, no reaction to the viral fame. Because for once, the point wasn't to extend the spotlight. It was to say one true thing. Say it clearly and leave it behind. In an era of constant noise, one sentence had cut through. You don't tear down walls by shouting at people. You tear them down by listening, even to the ones you disagree with. And maybe, just maybe, that's why it stuck. He didn't win by yelling. Denzel Washington went on live TV expecting a fight. Kash Patel thought he'd corner Denzel, humiliate him in front of millions. But within minutes, the tone shifted, and one calm sentence turned the whole studio upside down. By the end, the audience was cheering, and Kash Patel was left speechless. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you never miss these moments. They thought they had him trapped. The morning schedule called for a candid conversation between Denzel Washington and Kash Patel. But everyone behind the scenes knew the real purpose. a takedown. Denzel walked onto the stage with a calm, steady smile, nodded to the crowd, and took his seat across from Kash. But the tension was thick, palpable, electric, almost scripted. From the moment Kash leaned forward for the first question, it was obvious. This wasn't an interview. It was an ambush. "So Denzel," Kash began, his voice edged with controlled sarcasm, "you've been very vocal lately in your support for a 100% tariff on foreign films. Do you really believe censorship and economic nationalism are the answer now?" The audience chuckled nervously. The camera zoomed in on Denzel. Without blinking, he leaned forward and said calmly, "Supporting American workers isn't censorship, it's survival." A long pause. Kash pressed on, louder. "You say you're protecting jobs, but isn't this just another way to push a political agenda? Why now? Why you?" Denzel turned to him, measured and steady. "Because I've seen what happens when Hollywood sells out. I've worked in this town for decades, and the minute you stop investing in your own people, your actors, your crews, your neighborhoods, you become a slave to markets that don't care about your culture." The crowd shifted. Some clapped. Others stayed silent. Kash narrowed his eyes. "You talk about culture, Denzel, but let's be honest. You've had a history, controversial remarks, mistakes in your past. Are we really supposed to take you seriously now, just because you're waving the American flag?" The jab was sharp. It hit hard. The studio went quiet. Denzel paused. He didn't flinch. He didn't get defensive. "I made mistakes, big ones, and I paid for them, but the fact that I'm sitting here today means something. I chose to face it, and I'll keep facing it if it means I can help fix what's broken." No applause, just silence. Then slowly a single clap. Another. The momentum started to shift. Kash tried to regain control. "But tariffs don't fix character, Denzel. You're talking about economic walls, but what about tearing down the walls you've built?" That's when it happened. Denzel leaned in. His voice dropped. "You don't tear down walls by shouting at people. You tear them down by listening, even to the ones you disagree with." The entire room froze. Nobody expected that. Not from him. Just like that, the narrative started to fracture. Kash Patel had planned a storm, but he forgot. Denzel Washington doesn't run from lightning. By the second segment, it was clear Kash was recalibrating. The teleprompters still suggested light political banter, but the vibe on set was anything but light. Kash shuffled his notes, glanced off camera. The cameras kept rolling. Denzel sat quietly, almost perfectly still, fingers lightly tapping the armrest. That calm unnerved them more than anger ever could. "So let's talk economics," Kash said, his tone sharper now. "You think slapping a 100% tariff on foreign films is going to help American jobs? Isn't that just going to start a trade war and make movie tickets more expensive?" Denzel nodded slowly, as if he'd just been asked the most reasonable question in the world. "I get it. Tariffs sound aggressive," Denzel replied, his voice calm but firm. "But you know what's more aggressive? The way we've let studios ship post-production overseas, cast from cheaper labor pools, and gut American crews just to save a buck." He glanced at the live audience, locking eyes with someone in the back row. "We're not competing, we're being undercut. And if we don't draw a line somewhere, Hollywood turns into a ghost town." A few claps rose from the audience. One person even cheered. The cameras didn't cut to the crowd, but the producers in the main room were already sweating. Kash pressed on. "But that's not how capitalism works, Denzel. If you can't compete globally, maybe you're not offering enough value." Denzel's jaw tightened for the first time. "You know what else capitalism needs to work? Fairness, a grip on reality. Right now, it's not a competition. It's a race to the bottom. And workers are the ones falling first." Kash leaned in, trying to keep control. "That sounds like a union talking point." "I'm fine with that," Denzel shot back, quicker this time. "Because the guy holding a boom mic on set, the woman editing footage until 3 a.m., they're not driving Lamborghinis, they're just trying to pay rent in Burbank." A pause, more claps. Then Kash slid a printed sheet of paper across the table. "This is from your last interview. You said, and I quote, "America should stop pretending globalism is the answer to everything." That's your stance? Denzel didn't even look at the quote. He just looked up. Yes. Isn't that just isolationism? No, he replied firmly. It's prioritizing what's real. We've let globalism become a mask for exploitation of workers, of culture, of trust. I'm not saying we shut the world out. I'm saying we stop selling ourselves short. The words hung heavy in the air. Kash broke the silence. You're turning this into some kind of populist crusade. Denzel leaned forward, calm but unshakable. No, I'm reminding people they deserve better. Just like that, the dynamic began to change. Not completely, not yet, but enough that Kash's next words came out a bit softer. Well, we'll be right back. As the camera panned out and the show went to commercial, you could see it in Kash's eyes. This wasn't going the way he planned, and he was running out of ways to stop it. The break was short, but the mood shift lingered. Producers whispered frantically into earpieces. Audience coordinators motioned for more applause. But it didn't matter. Something had shifted, and not just on screen. Denzel Washington wasn't just defending policy anymore. He was defending his presence. And Kash Patel could feel it slipping. When they returned from break, Kash wasted no time. Let's not pretend the past doesn't matter, he said. There are a lot of people who think you shouldn't even have a platform, Denzel. You've said things, hurtful, offensive things. Are we supposed to just forget that because you came here and made a few decent points? The air thickened. Denzel inhaled slowly, then looked straight ahead. I don't want anyone to forget, he said, his voice even. For a long time, I was angry, reckless. I hurt people, and there's no excuse for it. I've apologized, but I don't get to demand forgiveness. A few people in the audience nodded quietly. I came here knowing you'd bring it up, he continued, and you should, because growth doesn't come from avoiding the past. It comes from dragging it out, staring it in the face, and asking if you're still the same man. The studio was quiet again, not out of discomfort, but curiosity. Kash tried to regain the momentum. But how do we know this isn't just a rebrand, a comeback attempt? Denzel gave a faint smile. You don't. You can't. But if I was chasing applause, I wouldn't be sitting here right now talking about tariffs and culture wars, Denzel said, the hint of a smile at the edge of his lips. I'd be out selling another sequel. That line landed. Even Kash let out a reluctant chuckle, though he tried to hide it. But Kash wasn't finished. You say you've changed, but this tough guy nationalism, it sounds like the same old Denzel Washington, just with a different coat. And that was it, the moment. Denzel leaned in, calm but absolutely locked in. I don't think it's tough to want your country to stand on its own 2 feet. I think it's responsible. And I don't think it's nationalism to love the place that raised you and want to see it treat its people better. He paused, then added quietly, everyone's so scared of being called a name that we forgot how to stand for something. For a moment, nobody responded. Then, unexpectedly, applause, louder this time, longer and genuine. The audience wasn't reacting to perfection. They were responding to something else. Sincerity. Whether they agreed with him or not, they were listening, and that made all the difference. One of the panelists looked down at their notes, almost reluctantly. We're going to talk about Hollywood next, he said, but Denzel cut in gently. I am talking about Hollywood, an eyebrow raised across the table. Denzel continued, when your industry starts treating people like numbers, when the only thing that matters is overseas revenue, when honest dialogue gets labeled as dangerous, that's not entertainment. That's control, and we should all be concerned about that. No one interrupted. The producers didn't flash a cut signal. No one expected Denzel to be the one talking about control, certainly not like this. As the camera pulled back for another commercial, the faces on set said it all. Denzel Washington wasn't just answering questions, he was taking back the mic. By the time the third segment rolled around, the producers had stopped pretending this was going according to plan. Social media was buzzing. The show's live tweet feed exploded, half the hashtags praising Denzel Washington's candor, the other half accusing the panel of losing control of their own platform. Yet none of that tension showed up on camera. Kash returned with a forced smile, shifting gears. "Let's talk Hollywood," he said, fingers laced tightly in front of him. "You've been vocal about the industry turning its back on America, but haven't you benefited more from Hollywood than most?" Denzel leaned back, almost relaxed now. "I have," he said, "and that's exactly why I'm speaking out, because I've seen what happens behind the curtain, the way priorities shift, the way storytelling turns into propaganda, the way talent gets pushed aside for politics." Another panelist chimed in. "So you think Hollywood's broken?" "No," Denzel said. "I think it's scared." Kash cocked his head. "Scared of what?" Denzel didn't hesitate. "Scared of being irrelevant, scared of honesty, scared of the very people it claims to represent." The audience murmured. Someone in the front row clapped softly. Denzel leaned forward. "Look, we used to make films that challenged power, that asked hard questions. But now, if you challenge anything, you're labeled toxic, dangerous, outdated." He glanced across the table. "I've been all those things, but what I won't be is silent." Kash tried again. "But isn't some of this just accountability? The world's changed. People expect more now." "I'm not against accountability," Denzel replied. "I'm against selective accountability. We act like redemption is off the table, but only for certain people. You either believe in second chances or you don't. You can't sell forgiveness and cancel it at the same time," Denzel said, his voice unwavering. That one stung. Even Kash flinched. Sensing an opening, another panelist pressed in. "Isn't it convenient you're saying all this now when you have nothing left to lose?" Denzel didn't blink. "You're right, I've lost a lot. My reputation, opportunities, friends. But what I haven't lost is my voice." He paused deliberately. "And that's what makes people nervous." The audience erupted, louder than before. Applause, whistles, even a few cheers. For the first time, the panel looked genuinely shaken. Not because Denzel had said something outrageous, but because he hadn't. He was calm, measured, honest, and worst of all for them, he was being heard. Kash threw to commercial with a tight smile. "We'll be back in just a moment." But everyone watching knew the moment had already arrived. When the show returned, it wasn't just the studio that felt different. It was the audience. People who'd come in expecting a spectacle were now leaning forward, arms crossed, brows furrowed. Not with anger, but with interest. You could feel it. Something rare was happening. Kash, clearly thrown off, tried to redirect the conversation. "Okay, let's step away from the politics for a moment. Let's talk about your career. You've had massive highs and very public lows. Why come back now?" Denzel looked around the room, then settled his eyes on Kash. "Because we don't have time to wait anymore. Because this industry, this country is at a breaking point. And if people who've seen the inside don't speak up, who will?" A beat, the audience murmured. Another panelist cut in. "You're saying Hollywood's collapsing? Isn't that a little dramatic?" Denzel turned toward him. "Not collapsing, evolving into something it was never meant to be. It used to be a place for stories. Now it's a place for slogans. And when everything becomes a message, nobody hears the truth anymore." A panelist looked up sharply. "So what's your truth, Denzel?" He didn't miss a beat. "That every artist, every worker, every American should be able to create, speak, disagree, without being exiled for it. That free speech doesn't end when someone gets uncomfortable. That patriotism isn't hate, and love of country isn't extremism." Applause, not polite applause, real, spontaneous. Even Kash looked surprised. Denzel continued, "They say we need more diversity in Hollywood. Fine. Start with a diversity of thought. I've worked with people of every background, every belief. But you know what gets shut down the fastest? An opinion that doesn't toe the narrative." Now the audience was nodding, arms uncrossed, phones were out, recording. Another panelist crossed his arms. "And what about your narrative? What about the damage done by your past words, your past actions?" Denzel nodded. "I live with it every day, and I should. But growth isn't proven by hiding. It's proven by showing up and speaking, even when you know people still doubt you." He looked out at the audience. "If I came here to be liked, I'd have said something safe. But I didn't. I came here because it matters. Because what we say in rooms like this ripples outside of them. Silence. Then more applause. A few people stood. Kash raised his hands, half joking. Okay, we get it. Denzel Washington is trending. That got some laughs, but the tension had cracked. The audience had turned, not against the panel necessarily, but towards something else. Something real. And the hosts knew it. The next segment was coming fast. Producers scrambled to change the tone. But the momentum, that belonged to Denzel now. The producers didn't want a repeat of the last segment, but by now it was out of their hands. They tried shifting topics, softening the tone, even cutting to commercial early. None of it worked. Denzel Washington was controlling the tempo, and worse for them, he wasn't doing it with anger or theatrics. He was doing it with composure. The next segment started with Kash Patel trying to cool things down. Denzel, we've talked politics, industry, the past, he said with a tight smile. Let's talk about solutions. What do you think Hollywood and America needs right now? Denzel didn't even blink. Truth, he said, even when it's ugly, especially when it's ugly. The studio fell quiet. Right now, we're more afraid of offending people than we are of lying to them. That's the problem. We don't need safer spaces. We need braver conversations. A few people applauded, then more. One of the panelists leaned forward, trying to take it back to familiar ground. But conversations without accountability just become noise. Shouldn't there be consequences for spite that hurts people? Absolutely, Denzel said. Oh, but there's a difference between hurting someone and disagreeing with them. We've lost that distinction. We've made discomfort a crime, Bertrand. He paused, then added, and we've convinced ourselves that only one side gets to define what offensive means. There it was, the sentence. It was quiet at first, like a door closing somewhere backstage, but the effect was instant. Kash blinked. Another panelist sat back. The next host parted their lips like they were about to respond, but didn't. The audience was still, as if holding their breath. The words weren't shouted, weren't angry, but they struck home. Because they didn't just challenge the panel, they challenged the room. And for a moment, no one had a comeback. Denzel let the silence linger. I'm not here to win anyone over, he said. I'm here to say what's true. And if we can't do that without fear, then we've already lost. That's when it happened. A voice from the crowd shouted, "Let him speak!" Applause followed, then cheering. The panel tried to smile to brush it off, but something had clearly broken loose. The script, the one they'd written in their heads, was gone. Now they were the ones reacting, and Denzel was leading. Another commercial break came, but this time no one moved, because no one wanted to miss what came next. Back from commercial, the studio looked the same, but it wasn't, not anymore. The camera panned across the panelists, but something had shifted. Their posture was stiffer, their smiles tighter, the energy had changed. And Denzel Washington, he was still steady, still calm, but now there was an edge to him. As if he knew this was the moment everything had been building toward. Kash jumped in first, pushing harder now. You say you're here to speak truth, he said, his voice slightly raised. But let's be honest, when you speak it divides people. You're not some unifier, Denzel. You're a symbol for outrage, for controversy,